He laughed at her worthless cabin until she opened what had been hidden there for 30 years. The lawyer's voice barely echoed in the quiet room when they said her name. No one looked at her. Not really. They were already dividing everything that mattered. Then came the cabin. Old, remote, forgotten. Her stepson laughed, just once like it was nothing. But something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Would you have taken the money and walked away or gone to see that cabin yourself? The law office smelled faintly of paper and something sharper, cleaner maybe. Margaret couldn't quite place it. Disinfectant, perhaps, or just the absence of anything warm. She sat in a leather chair that was too soft, her hands folded in her lap, fingers pressed together like she was trying to keep them from drifting apart. The air hummed quietly from a vent above. A clock ticked somewhere behind her, slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. Across the long mahogany table, Trevor leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting over his knee. He looked comfortable, relaxed, as if this were just another meeting, another transaction. Beside him, his sister, Lila, scrolled through something on her phone, her thumb moving without pause. She didn't look up when the attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Ellison," the man said gently, adjusting his glasses. "We'll begin with the primary assets." Margaret nodded once. She didn't trust her voice yet. The attorney's voice was calm, practiced. He spoke in measured sentences, each one landing neatly, like stones placed in a careful line. The residence on Brookfield Drive, valued at approximately $680,000, will be divided equally between Mr. Trevor Ellison and Ms. Lila Grant. Trevor gave a small nod. Lila didn't react. Her phone screen lit her face faintly blue. Margaret kept her eyes on the table. The wood was polished so smooth she could see the blur of her own reflection. Not clear enough to recognize, just a shape, a presence. "The investment accounts," the attorney continued, "will be distributed in the same manner." Trevor leaned forward slightly now, interest sharpening. Papers shifted. Pens tapped. Numbers were spoken like they belonged to someone else's life. Margaret listened. She listened the way she had listened for years, quietly, without interruption. 40 years of marriage, and she found herself waiting for her turn. It came almost as an afterthought. And finally, the attorney said, glancing down at the last page, "There is a property located in Pocahontas County, West Virginia." There was a brief pause. Margaret lifted her eyes. "A cabin," he clarified, "owned solely by Mr. Daniel Ellison." Trevor let out a short laugh. Not loud, not cruel in a way you could point to, but it cut clean all the same. "That place?" he said, shaking his head. "You've got to be kidding." Lila looked up now, finally interested. "The one up in the woods?" she asked. "I thought that thing was falling apart." Trevor gave a half smile, glancing across the table toward Margaret for the first time. "That's generous," he said. "Last time I saw it, the roof looked like it was one storm away from caving in." The attorney shifted slightly in his seat, but didn't interrupt. "The property," he continued, carefully, "has been left in full to Mrs. Margaret Ellison." Trevor's smile widened just a little. "Well," he said, leaning back again, "there you go." He spread his hands like the matter had resolved itself. "You get the cabin." The words hung in the air. Lila let out a soft breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh, but close enough. She glanced at Margaret briefly, then back down at her phone. Trevor added, almost as an afterthought, "Honestly, it's barely worth the gas to get there." No one corrected him. No one even looked at Margaret to see how it landed. The clock kept ticking. Margaret felt something shift inside her, small and quiet. Not a sharp pain, not anger, just a settling, like dust after something had been dropped. She lowered her gaze again, back to the polished wood. The cabin. She tried to picture it. She couldn't. She had heard about it, of course, over the years, in passing, always in the same tone, casual, dismissive. Just a place up north, Daniel would say, needs fixing. He had gone there often, once a month, sometimes more, always alone. She had never asked too many questions. There had always been other things to tend to. Dinner, bills, the kids, life in all its ordinary weight. Now that place, something she had never seen, never touched, was what remained for her. The attorney began speaking again, moving on to final signatures, closing remarks. Papers slid across the table. Trevor signed quickly. Lila followed without looking up for long. When the folder reached Margaret, she hesitated for just a moment before picking up the pen. Her hand was steady. She signed her name the same way she always had. Careful, even, no flourish. Margaret Ellison. She set the pen down gently. Chairs shifted, jackets rustled. Trevor was already checking his watch. "We should get moving," he said to Lila. "I've got a call at 2. Lila nodded, gathering her things. Trevor stood, buttoning his coat, then glanced once more toward Margaret. "If you ever want to get rid of that cabin," he said, casual again, like they were discussing an old piece of furniture, "let me know. I might know someone who'd take it off your hands." He didn't wait for an answer. The two of them were already heading toward the door. The attorney offered Margaret a polite, practiced smile. "If you have any questions, Mrs. Ellison, don't hesitate to reach out." She nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. The door closed behind the others with a muted click. Silence settled over the room. Margaret remained seated. For a moment, she didn't move at all. The hum of the vent, the ticking clock, the faint scent of paper. She looked down at her hands. They rested in her lap, exactly where she had placed them at the beginning still. Useful hands, she thought absently, hands that had done everything that needed doing. Now they had been given a cabin. She let out a slow breath. Then, almost without meaning to, she lifted her eyes again and looked at the empty chairs across the table. At the place where Trevor had laughed. It hadn't been loud, but it lingered, and beneath it, just beneath it, something else had taken root. Not anger. Not yet. Just a quiet, persistent unease, the kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that waits. Margaret carried it with her all the way home. The sky over Cleveland had turned a dull gray by the time she stepped out of the taxi. The cold air settled into her coat immediately, slipping through the seams like it knew the way in. She stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the small brick house she had lived in for nearly 20 years. Nothing about it had changed. The same white curtains in the front window, the same narrow steps leading up to the door, the same wind chime hanging just to the right, tapping softly against itself with each passing breeze. She reached into her purse, found her keys by touch, and let herself in. The house greeted her the way it always did, with stillness. Not empty, just quiet. She set her purse down on the small table by the door and slipped off her shoes. The floor beneath her feet was cool, familiar. She moved through the rooms without thinking, turning on lights one by one, as if following a path she had walked 1,000 times. In the kitchen, she paused. The dish rack was still full from the morning. A mug, a plate, a small saucepan she had used to heat oatmeal. She crossed the room and began drying them, one at a time, placing each item back where it belonged. It was automatic. The rhythm of it. Dry, place, repeat. For a while, that was all there was. When she finished, she wiped the counter, folded the dish towel neatly, and hung it over the oven handle. Then she stood there, hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, staring at nothing in particular. The house felt off. Not different, just hollow. She moved to the living room and reached for the watering can beside the armchair. The plants along the window needed tending. They always did by late afternoon. She watered them carefully, the way she had learned over the years. Never too much, never too little. A little patience, a little attention. One leaf at a time. As she worked, her eyes drifted to the empty chair across from hers. Daniel's chair. It still had the faint indentation where he used to sit, leaning slightly to one side, remote in hand. He never sat straight, never fully relaxed either. Always half ready to get up, to move, to go somewhere. Even when there was nowhere to go. Margaret set the watering can down. She could see him there, if she let herself. Boots by the door, jacket slung over the back of the chair, the smell of motor oil clinging faintly to his sleeves. Just fixing something up north, he would say. Always the same words. She had never asked much beyond that. There had always been something else that needed doing. Dinner to prepare. Laundry to finish. A call from school. Trevor, at 14, standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed, refusing to eat what she made. Lila, at 9, crying over a broken science project the night before it was due. Margaret had been there for all of it. She could see it now, as clearly as if it were happening again. Trevor slamming the door. Lila curled up on the couch with a fever. The clock on the stove blinking past midnight while she packed lunches for the next day. She had learned how to move through it without stopping, without asking for anything back. She turned away from the window and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The air felt cooler there. She opened the closet. Daniel's clothes were still hanging where he had left them. Work shirts, neatly pressed, a few jackets, the heavier coat he wore in winter, still carrying the faint scent of cedar from storage. She reached out and touched the sleeve of one shirt. It was just fabric now, nothing more. But for a moment, she remembered the weight of it on his shoulders, the way he would stand in the doorway early in the morning, tying his boots, saying very little before heading out. He had never been a man of many words. Not distant, just contained. Margaret let her hand fall. On the top shelf of the closet sat a small wooden box. She had seen it before, countless times probably. It wasn't hidden, just there. Plain, dark wood, smooth from years of use. She had never opened it. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe because it had never seemed important. Or maybe because some things, over time, become part of the background. You stop seeing them. Like the cabin. She stepped back, closing the closet door gently. In the kitchen, the clock ticked forward another minute. Margaret returned to the living room and sat down in her chair, The cushion gave slightly beneath her weight, familiar and worn. Her hands rested in her lap again, the same position as earlier. She let out a slow breath. For years, her days had been full. Not busy in a way that called attention, but full in the quiet sense. There had always been something that needed her, someone. Now, there was space where those things had been. And in that space, thoughts had room to settle. The cabin. She tried again to picture it. This time, something came. Not clear, just fragments. A mention here and there over the years. A place up north. Needs work. Nothing special. She realized something then. In all those years, she had never once asked to go. The thought landed heavier than she expected, not because she felt regret, but because she couldn't remember ever thinking it mattered. She leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the window glass. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. And in that quiet, something shifted again. Not loud, not urgent, just a small, steady awareness. The cabin wasn't just a place she had been given. It was a place she had never known. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, that felt different now. Different enough that she couldn't quite let it go. The kind of feeling that stays. The kind that doesn't settle. Not yet. Margaret woke earlier than usual the next morning. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that sits heavier before sunrise. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the furnace kicking on somewhere below. Sleep hadn't come easily. Not because of grief. That part had already found its place. Low, steady, familiar. It was something else now. Something smaller, sharper. Like a loose thread she couldn't stop noticing. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood slowly, her joints stiff from the cold. The floor creaked under her weight, the same boards that had always creaked in the same places. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The click of the burner sounded louder than usual. While she waited, she opened the drawer by the refrigerator and pulled out a small notepad. Grocery lists filled most of the pages. Reminders, phone numbers written in careful script. She flipped it open, then closed it again. No list today. The kettle began to whistle softly. She poured the water over a tea bag, watching the color spread slowly through the cup. She carried it to the dining table. Daniel's papers were still stacked there. She had moved them the night before without really thinking, just to clear space. Now they sat in a neat pile, tied loosely with a rubber band that had lost most of its stretch. Margaret set her tea down and sat. For a moment, she didn't touch anything. Then, with a quiet breath, she reached forward and slid the papers closer. Bills, bank statements, insurance documents, the usual things. She moved through them slowly, her fingers careful, deliberate. She wasn't rushing. There was no urgency in the way she handled them, just attention. Halfway through the stack, something shifted. A receipt. It was folded in half, tucked between two statements. The paper was thinner than the others, slightly worn at the edges. She opened it. A hardware store, not local. She read the address once, then again, West Virginia. Her fingers paused. The date sat near the top, printed clearly in black ink 6 months ago. Margaret frowned slightly. She set the receipt aside and continued. Another one appeared a few pages later. Same store, different date. Then another. Different store this time, same state. She gathered them together, placing them side by side on the table. The pattern was quiet, but it was there, not random. She reached for her tea, took a small sip, then set the cup down again without finishing it. Her eyes moved back to the dates. They weren't clustered. They stretched out over time. Months apart. Years, even. She pushed her chair back slightly and stood, moving toward the hallway. Her steps were slow, but there was purpose in them now. In the bedroom, she opened the closet again. The small wooden box sat where it always had. This time she reached for it. It was lighter than she expected. She brought it down carefully and carried it back to the table. For a moment, she just looked at it. Then she lifted the lid. Inside were papers. Not many, just enough to fill the bottom. She picked one up. More receipts. More notes. A folded map. Her hands stilled. The map was older, creased from being opened and closed many times. The edges were soft, the paper slightly faded. She unfolded it slowly. West Virginia, the same area she had seen on the receipts. A route had been drawn in pen. Not a straight line. It curved through smaller roads branching off from the main highway. Margaret leaned closer. There were markings along the way. Small circles, a few arrows. And at the far edge of the map, near a cluster of hills, a single X. Her breath caught slightly. She knew that handwriting. Daniels. She traced one of the lines lightly with her finger. From Cleveland, down through Ohio, across the state line, into the mountains. The path wasn't complicated, but it was deliberate. She looked back at the receipts, then at the map, then back again. Something didn't fit. Daniel had said he went once in a while. That's what she remembered. A weekend here, a trip there. But this. She began sorting the receipts by date, laying them out across the table. Year after year. Not every month, but close. Close enough. Her fingers moved faster now, though still careful. She checked each date, each location, aligning them in a quiet line. The pattern became clearer with every piece she placed. This wasn't occasional. This was routine. Regular, intentional. Margaret stepped back slightly, looking down at the table. 30 years. The number formed in her mind without her meaning to calculate it. 30 years of trips. 30 years of receipts. 30 years of something she had never really seen. She felt it again, that small shift inside her. But this time, it was sharper, more defined. She pulled out a chair and sat again, her eyes fixed on the map. The X at the edge of the hills. The cabin. Her cabin now. She tried to remember every time he had mentioned it. Every time he had left. Friday afternoons, early mornings, the quiet way he would pack a small bag without saying much. She had filled those spaces without question. Made dinner anyway. Set his place at the table out of habit, then cleared it again when he wasn't there. It had never seemed important. Until now. Margaret reached for the map and folded it carefully along its original creases. Then she picked up the receipts and stacked them neatly. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. But something had changed. The unease from the day before had taken shape. It had edges now. And direction. She looked once more at the stack of papers in front of her. Then at the quiet kitchen around her. The light had shifted slightly through the window, soft morning gray turning into something brighter. Margaret stood. She gathered the receipts, the map, and placed them together inside the wooden box. But she didn't put it back in the closet. Instead, she set it on the counter within reach, as if she might need it again. Her tea had gone cold on the table. She didn't notice. She stood there for a moment, hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, eyes unfocused. Then she spoke, softly, almost to herself. "That's not what you told me." The words hung in the air. Not angry, not accusing, just true. Margaret exhaled slowly, and in that breath, something settled into place. Not resignation, not yet. Something else, something that moved. Margaret didn't touch the box again that morning. She left it on the counter where she had placed it, as if moving it might disturb whatever had begun to take shape in her mind. Instead, she went about the rest of her day the way she always had, slowly, carefully, one task at a time. But nothing felt quite the same. She vacuumed the living room, the steady hum filling the space. She wiped down the kitchen counters again, though they were already clean. She folded a stack of towels that didn't need folding. Her hands stayed busy. Her thoughts did not. The map stayed with her. Even when she wasn't looking at it, she could see it. The curve of the road, the small marks, the X. By mid-afternoon, the house felt too quiet. Margaret turned off the vacuum and stood still in the center of the living room. The silence pressed in around her again, thicker now. She looked toward the kitchen. The wooden box sat exactly where she had left it. She took a step toward it, then another. Just as she reached the counter, the phone rang. The sound startled her. It cut through the stillness sharply, echoing against the walls. She hesitated, then picked it up. "Hello?" "Margaret." Trevor's voice came through, smooth, familiar in a way that felt distant now. "I wanted to check in," he said. "Make sure you got home okay yesterday." "I did," she replied. A pause. "Well, good," he said. "Listen, I've been thinking about that cabin." Margaret didn't respond right away. She turned slightly, her eyes drifting to the box on the counter. "It's really not something you want to deal with," Trevor continued. "The upkeep alone, it's probably a mess by now. And the taxes, I mean." He let out a small breath, like he was doing her a favor just by mentioning it. Margaret listened. "I could take it off your hands," he added. "Make things easier for you. No sense holding on to something that's just going to be a burden." There it was. Quick. Clean. Too clean. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. "How much?" she asked. Trevor didn't hesitate. 15,000, he said. "Cash. I can handle all the paperwork. You won't have to worry about a thing." 15. The number sat there, flat and unremarkable. Margaret turned her head and looked out the kitchen window. The sky had cleared a little. Pale sunlight filtered through the branches of the tree in the yard, casting thin shadows across the glass. "Trevor," she said quietly. "Yeah? I haven't even seen it." Another pause. "Well, that's kind of my point," he replied lightly. "There's nothing to see. It's just an old place in the woods." Margaret said nothing. On the other end of the line, she could hear the faint sound of traffic, a car door closing, someone speaking in the distance. Trevor's world was moving. Hers had slowed. "You trust me, don't you?" he added. The question landed gently, too gently. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. She saw the receipts, the map, the careful markings. 30 years. "I'll think about it," she said. "Margaret, I said I'll think about it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was a brief silence. Then Trevor exhaled, softer this time. "All right," he said. "Just don't wait too long. Things like that, they don't get better with time." "I understand." They said their goodbyes. The line clicked. Margaret set the phone down slowly. For a moment, she stood there without moving. Then she turned back to the counter. The wooden box waited. She opened it again, more quickly this time. The map came out first. She spread it across the table, smoothing the creases with her palm. The route stared back at her. Clear, direct, real. She reached for one of the receipts and held it up beside the map. Same place, same direction, same story, just not the one she had been told. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat. The clock ticked quietly behind her. Minutes passed, maybe more. She didn't count them. Her eyes moved between the map and the window, back and forth, as if something outside might answer a question she hadn't fully asked yet. 15,000. She almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because it wasn't. It was telling. She thought about Trevor's voice, the ease of it, the way he had already decided what the cabin was worth, what she was supposed to do with it, what she should want. Margaret leaned back in her chair. For years, she had made decisions like that. Quiet ones, small ones. What to cook, what to fix, what to let go. Things that kept everything running. Things that didn't ask for attention. This felt different. She looked down at her hands, still steady, still capable. She placed them flat on the table, one on either side of the map. Then she nodded, once. Not to anyone else, just to herself. "I'm going," she said aloud. The words settled into the room, simple, certain. She stood. The house seemed to shift around her again, not changing, but opening slightly, as if something had been unlatched. Margaret moved with quiet purpose now. She went to the bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the closet. It was smaller than the one she used to use for longer trips, just enough for a few days. She set it on the bed and opened it. Sweaters first, the heavier ones, then socks, undergarments, a pair of sturdy shoes. She moved methodically, folding each item with care. From the dresser, she took a small photograph and slipped it into the side pocket. She didn't look at it closely. She didn't need to. Back in the kitchen, she folded the map again and placed it inside her purse. The receipts followed. The wooden box she left behind. Not because it didn't matter, but because she didn't need all of it. Just enough. She paused by the counter, her hand resting lightly on the surface. For a moment, she listened. To the house, to the quiet, to herself. Then she turned off the light and began to get ready to leave. For the first time in a long while, Margaret wasn't waiting for something to happen. She was going to meet it. The bus station smelled like burnt coffee and damp wool. Margaret stood near the ticket counter, her suitcase at her side, her purse strap looped twice around her wrist. The floor beneath her shoes was worn smooth in places, scuffed by years of people passing through, coming, going, never staying long. She wasn't used to places like this. She had always traveled for a reason, a visit, a holiday, something planned. This felt different, uncertain, but steady. "Next," the clerk called. Margaret stepped forward. "One ticket," she said. "As far as this will take me." She unfolded the map slightly, pointing to a town near the edge of the marked route. The clerk leaned in, squinting. "West Virginia," he said. "You'll need a transfer in Charleston." Then another line heading south. "That's fine." He tapped a few keys, printed the ticket, and slid it across the counter. Margaret took it, along with her change. "Platform 3, he added. She nodded. The bus was half full. Margaret chose a seat by the window, placing her suitcase beneath her feet. The fabric of the seat was rough against her coat, slightly worn but clean enough. Outside, the sky hung low and pale. The engine started with a deep rumble, vibrating through the floor. The bus pulled away slowly, merging into the late afternoon traffic. Cleveland faded behind her. Brick buildings gave way to stretches of highway. The familiar lines of the city softened, then disappeared entirely. Margaret watched it all without speaking. The map sat folded in her purse. She didn't need to look at it. Not yet. The first leg of the journey passed quietly. A man across the aisle dozed with his head tilted back, mouth slightly open. A young woman near the front tapped at her phone, earbuds in place. Somewhere behind Margaret, a child asked the same question twice before being gently hushed. The rhythm of the road settled in, the hum of the engine, the sway of the bus, the soft, constant motion. Margaret let her head rest lightly against the window. The glass was cool. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The landscape had changed. Flat stretches of road gave way to rolling hills. Trees grew closer together, their branches reaching inward as if narrowing the palm. The light shifted too, softer, filtered. They stopped in Charleston just after dusk. The station was smaller, quieter. The air outside carried a faint scent of wood smoke. Margaret stepped off the bus carefully, stretching her legs, adjusting her coat. She followed the signs toward the next platform, her suitcase wheels clicking softly over the concrete. Her second bus was smaller, older. The driver, a man with gray at his temples and a steady, quiet presence, nodded as she climbed aboard. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Margaret hesitated for half a second. "Pocahontas County," she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "Not many folks go that way this time of year." "I suppose not." He gave a small nod and gestured her inside. The seats were narrower, the windows slightly fogged at the edges. Margaret took a seat near the middle this time. The bus filled slowly. A man in work boots, a woman carrying a grocery bag, an older couple who spoke in low voices, close together. The doors closed. The engine started again, and they began to climb. The road curved almost immediately. Margaret felt it in the shift of her body, the subtle pull to one side. She placed her hand lightly on the seat in front of her, steadying herself. Outside, the darkness deepened, but not completely. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow across the hills. The outlines of trees appeared and disappeared as the bus moved, shadows stretching and folding into one another. Margaret watched. The world felt different here, less defined, less predictable. The road narrowed. At times it seemed to disappear entirely into the trees before curving back into view. She reached into her purse and pulled out the map. Carefully, she unfolded it just enough to see the route. Her finger traced the line. They were close now. Closer than she had expected. She folded the map again and returned it to her bag. The bus stopped once more, this time along a quiet roadside lit by a single flickering street lamp. "End of the line," the driver said. Margaret gathered her things and stepped down. The air was colder here. sharper. She pulled her coat tighter around her. For a moment, she stood alone. The bus pulled away behind her, its taillights fading into the dark. Silence followed. Not the kind she was used to. This was deeper. Full. The kind that carried its own sound. Gravel crunched nearby. Margaret turned. A pickup truck rolled slowly into view, its headlights cutting through the dark. The window lowered. "You Margaret Ellison?" The voice was calm, familiar in tone, though she didn't recognize it. "Yes," she said. The man nodded. "Name's Carl," he said. "Driver called ahead. Said you might need a ride." Margaret hesitated only a moment. Then she stepped forward. "Thank you." Carl climbed out and took her suitcase, placing it gently in the back of the truck. "Not much out here," he said, as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Gotta help where we can." The truck pulled onto a narrow road. Gravel shifted beneath the tires. The headlights illuminated only a short stretch ahead. Beyond that, darkness. Margaret looked out the window. Trees lined both sides of the road, tall and close, their branches forming a kind of tunnel overhead. They drove in silence for a while. Then Carl spoke again. "You said Ellison, right?" "Yes." "Daniel Ellison?" Margaret turned slightly. "Yes." Carl nodded slowly, his eyes on the road. "Figured," he said. "He used to come through here." Margaret's chest tightened just slightly. "How often?" she asked. Carl gave a short breath. "Every month," he said, "like clockwork." The words settled between them. Margaret looked back out at the road, the trees, the narrow path ahead. Every month. She pressed her hand lightly against her coat, feeling the shape of the folded map inside her purse. Carl slowed the truck as the road curved again, then straightened. "Quiet man," he added, kept to himself, but he knew this road better than most. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The unease from before had shifted again. Not fading, not growing. Just changing. Becoming something clearer, something she could no longer ignore. The truck climbed one final incline, then slowed to a stop. Carl nodded ahead. "That's as far as I go tonight," he said. Margaret looked up. Through the trees, just barely visible in the moonlight, was a wooden gate. Beyond it, a narrow path. And somewhere past that, the cabin. She stepped out of the truck, the cold air catching her breath for a moment. Carl handed her suitcase over. "You'll be all right from here," he said. Margaret nodded. "I will." He gave her a small, respectful look, then climbed back into the truck. The engine started. The headlights turned, and just like that, he was gone. Margaret stood alone. The gate creaked softly as the wind brushed against it. She took a step forward, then another. Her hand reached out, fingers wrapping around the cold metal latch. She paused. Just for a moment. Then she pushed it open and stepped through. Behind her, the world she knew had already begun to fade. Ahead, something waited, and for the first time she was close enough to feel it. Margaret stepped through the gate and let it fall shut behind her with a soft, hollow clang. The path ahead was narrower than she expected. Not a road, really. More like a long strip of worn earth, pressed down by years of tires and boots. Gravel crunched lightly beneath her shoes as she moved forward, pulling her suitcase behind her. The wheels caught every few feet. She didn't mind. The air smelled different here. Damp leaves, pine, something colder beneath it all, like stone that hadn't seen the sun in a while. The trees closed in as she walked. Branches stretched overhead, crossing into one another, forming a loose canopy that filtered the moonlight into broken patches along the ground. Shadows shifted as the wind moved through them. Margaret walked slowly. Not out of fear, out of attention. Every step felt like it mattered. The path curved slightly, then straightened, and then she saw it. The cabin. It stood about 50 yards ahead, partially hidden by the trees. Margaret stopped. For a moment, she didn't move. This was the place Trevor had laughed about, the place he had dismissed without a second thought. She took a few more steps forward. The cabin came into clearer view. Weathered, yes. The wood siding had faded to a soft gray, worn smooth by years of wind and rain. The roof sloped gently, patched in places, but not poorly, not neglected, maintained. Margaret frowned slightly. That wasn't what she expected. She walked closer. The front steps were solid, no sagging, no broken boards. The railing was firm beneath her hand as she reached out and touched it. Someone had repaired it. Not recently, maybe, but not long ago either. Her eyes moved slowly across the structure. The windows were intact. Clean. Not covered in dust or grime. She stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked softly under her weight, but it held. Margaret set her suitcase down beside the door and stood there for a moment, listening. The forest around her was quiet. Not silent. Alive in its own way. A distant rustle. The faint sound of wind moving through branches. Something small shifting in the undergrowth. But no sign of abandonment. No sense that this place had been left behind. She reached for the doorknob. It turned easily. Unlocked. Margaret hesitated only briefly before pushing the door open. The hinges moved without resistance. The door swung inward. The smell met her first. Not decay, not damp neglect. Something cleaner. Wood. Oil. Faint, but present. She stepped inside. The cabin was dim, but not dark. Enough light filtered through the windows to outline the room. Margaret closed the door behind her. The sound echoed softly. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust. The main room was simple. A small table near the window. 2 chairs. A narrow couch against the far wall. A wood stove in the corner. Nothing extravagant, but nothing broken. Nothing abandoned. She moved forward slowly. Her fingers brushed the surface of the table. No dust, not even a thin layer. She paused. That didn't make sense. Margaret looked around more carefully now. The floor was clean. The furniture was arranged with purpose. A folded blanket rested neatly over the back of the couch. She stepped closer. The fabric was worn, but freshly washed. She could tell. The scent lingered faintly. Her gaze shifted to the shelves along the wall. Supplies, canned goods, dry food. A few tools placed carefully beside them. Not scattered. Organized. Deliberate. Margaret's unease deepened. She moved toward the kitchen area, a small extension of the main room, separated only by a slight change in flooring. A counter, a sink, a set of cabinets. She opened one. Dishes stacked neatly. She opened another. More supplies. Rice, beans, coffee. Her hand hovered for a moment over a tin container. She opened it. The smell of coffee rose immediately. Fresh. Not new, but not old either. Used recently. Margaret closed the lid slowly. Her heart beat a little faster now. Not panic. Just awareness. This place wasn't forgotten. It had been used, maintained, cared for. Her eyes moved again, slower this time, looking for what didn't belong. That's when she noticed it. The tools. On a small workbench near the back wall. Wrenches, screwdrivers, a hammer, all lined up, clean, placed in exact positions, not thrown down, not left behind. Set. Like someone had just finished using them. Margaret stepped closer. She reached out and touched one of the wrenches, shown, but not rusted. Not worn from disuse. Her fingers tightened slightly around the metal before she set it back exactly where it had been. She stepped back, and that's when she saw it. The floor. Near the far corner of the room. One section, barely noticeable at first glance, sat just slightly higher than the rest. Not enough to trip over, but enough to catch the eye. Margaret moved toward it slowly. Each step measured. She stood over the spot and looked down. The wood was the same as the rest of the floor, same color, same grain. But the edges were cleaner, more defined, as if it had been lifted before, more than once. Margaret crouched slightly, placing her hand flat against the surface. She pressed down. Solid. She shifted her weight, tapped it lightly with her knuckles. A dull sound echoed back. Not hollow. Not fully. But different. She tapped again. Listened. Her breath slowed. Her mind began to settle into a different rhythm now. Not confusion, not shock. Focus. Margaret straightened slowly, her eyes never leaving that spot on the floor. Everything else in the cabin had answered one question. This answered another. Trevor had been wrong. About all of it. This place wasn't falling apart. It wasn't forgotten. It wasn't worthless. Margaret turned slowly, taking in the room again, but this time differently. Not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as someone looking for something. Her eyes moved from object to object. The tools, the supplies, the clean surfaces, the careful order. All of it pointed in one direction. This wasn't just a place someone came to. This was a place someone worked. Her chest tightened slightly. 30 years. The number returned. Sat heavier now. Margaret took a step back from the raised floorboard. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. She wasn't ready to open it. Not yet. She needed to see everything else first, to understand the space before she uncovered what it was hiding. Margaret walked back toward the center of the room, her movements slower now, more deliberate. She reached for the back of one of the chairs and rested her hand there, steadying herself. The cabin held its silence around her. Not empty, not abandoned. Waiting. And now so was she. Margaret stood in the center of the cabin, her hand still resting on the back of the chair. The room felt smaller than before. Not physically, but in the way silence can shift when something underneath it begins to reveal itself. She turned her head slowly, looking again at the corner where the floor rose just slightly above the rest. The difference was subtle. Easy to miss. Easy to ignore. But now that she had seen it, she couldn't unsee it. Margaret let go of the chair. She walked toward the corner again, her steps careful, measured. The floor creaked softly under her weight, each sound sharper now, more distinct. She stopped over the raised section. For a moment, she just stood there, listening. Her breathing. The wind outside. The faint tick of something settling in the wood of the cabin. Nothing else. She crouched slowly, lowering herself with both hands braced against her knees. Her joints protested quietly, but she ignored it. Her eyes traced the edges of the boards. There. A thin line, not wide, but cleaner than the others. Margaret reached out and ran her fingers along it. The wood was smooth, worn, but not aged the same way as the rest. This had been touched, handled, opened, more than once. She pressed down again, harder this time. Solid. She shifted her hand and tapped once more with her knuckles. The sound came back dull, but not uniform. There was space beneath it. Not much, but enough. Margaret exhaled slowly. Then she looked around the room. Not searching blindly, looking for something that would make sense. Her gaze landed on the workbench, the tools. Carefully arranged, not decorative, functional. She stood again, her movement slower now, deliberate. She crossed the room and picked up a flathead screwdriver. It felt right in her hand. Balanced. Oozed. Margaret returned to the raised section of floor and knelt again. She studied the edge more closely this time. Near the corner, just barely visible, was a small indentation. Not a crack. Not damage. A place to grip. She slid the tip of the screwdriver into it. Paused. Her hand tightened slightly. Not fear, just awareness. Then she pressed. The wood resisted at first, then gave. A faint shift. Barely audible. Margaret adjusted her grip and pried again, a little harder this time. The board lifted a fraction of an inch. Dust didn't rise. No smell of decay. Just the sound of wood moving against wood. She set the screwdriver aside and slid her fingers into the opening. The edges were smooth enough to hold. She pulled slowly, carefully. The section of floor lifted. Not a single board. A panel, rectangular, fitted cleanly into place. It came up with more weight than she expected, forcing her to shift her position slightly to keep balance. She set it aside. And then she saw it. A dark opening beneath the floor. A narrow staircase descending into shadow. Margaret didn't move. Her hands rested on her knees, her breath steady but deeper now. She leaned forward slightly, peering into the darkness. The air that rose from below was cool, not damp, not stale, clean. With a faint scent she couldn't immediately place. Something mechanical. Oil, maybe. Something worked. Not stored. Worked. Margaret sat back slowly, the reality settling in piece by piece. This wasn't a hidden storage space. This was something else. Something built. Her eyes moved once more around the cabin. The tools, the supplies, the order. All of it pointed here, to this opening, to whatever lay beneath it. She stood slowly again, steadying herself as she rose. Her body felt the effort now, but her mind stayed fixed. Margaret walked to the wall and found the small lantern hanging from a hook. She took it down, checked the switch. It clicked. A soft beam of light spilled out, steady and pale. She returned to the opening. The light cut into the darkness, revealing the first few steps. Wooden, narrow, worn but intact. They led down at a steep angle, disappearing into shadow after only a few feet. Margaret held the lantern just above the opening. Her fingers tightened around the handle. This was the moment. She knew it. The point where she could step back, close the panel, pretend none of this had happened, leave the questions where they were, unanswered. Safe. She looked behind her. The cabin stood quiet. Still. Waiting. Just as it had been when she arrived. Margaret turned back to the opening. 30 years. The number came again. He had come here. Every month. Every trip. For this. Whatever this was. She placed one foot on the first step. Tested it. It held. Solid. She shifted her weight, then placed her other foot beside it. The lantern cast long shadows against the walls of the narrow space. Margaret paused again, her hand resting lightly against the side of the opening. Not to stop herself, just to feel where she was. Then she began to descend. One step, then another. The sound of her movement echoed softly in the confined space. Above her, the cabin remained still. Below, something waited. And Margaret was no longer standing at the edge of it. She was going down to meet it. The steps were steeper than they looked. Margaret kept one hand against the wall as she descended, the wood cool and smooth beneath her palm. The lantern in her other hand cast a narrow beam ahead, catching dust in the air. But not much. Not enough for a place that had been sealed for years. That was the first thing she noticed. The air wasn't stale. It moved. Faintly, but enough to touch her face as she went lower. At the bottom, her foot met solid ground. Concrete. She paused there, letting her eyes adjust, letting the light settle across the space. Then she lifted the lantern and saw. The room stretched farther than she expected. Not wide, but long, built with intention. The walls were reinforced with wood panels, fitted tight, no gaps. A single overhead bulb hung near the center, connected to a cord that ran along the ceiling. Margaret reached up and found the switch. It clicked. The bulb flickered once, then held. Soft yellow light filled the room. She lowered the lantern slowly. What had been shadow became detail, and detail became something else entirely. Workbenches lined one side of the cellar. Not cluttered, organized. Tools arranged with care. Not just placed, but aligned. Each one in its own space like it belonged there. Metal parts lay in neat rows. Pipes, small valves, filters. Margaret stepped forward, her shoes making a dull sound against the concrete. She moved slowly. Not out of fear now, out of focus. Her eyes scanned the nearest table. A series of connected tubes rested across its surface, attached to a compact frame. The metal was clean, polished from use rather than neglect. She reached out and touched it. Cool. Solid. Real. Her fingers traced along one of the pipes, following its path until it connected to a small cylindrical chamber. A filter. She knew enough to recognize that, but not enough to understand all of it. Not yet. Margaret pulled her hand back and looked around again. Shelves ran along the far wall, stacked with notebooks. Dozens of them, identical in size, each one labeled with a year, written carefully in Daniel's handwriting. Her chest tightened. She stepped closer. The first notebook she reached for was marked 1994. She opened it. The pages were filled. Diagrams, measurements, notes written in tight, controlled lines. She flipped through slowly, each page built on the last. Changes, adjustments, failures crossed out, replaced with new ideas. Margaret closed it and picked up another. The drawings were more refined, cleaner, more precise. She opened a third. The system had changed again. Improved, refined further. Her fingers moved faster now, pulling one notebook after another, flipping pages, scanning details. Each one told the same story. Time, effort, persistence. 30 years. Not in words, in work. Margaret stepped back from the shelf, her breathing slower now, deeper. She turned again toward the center of the room. More structures stood there, larger ones, connected systems of pipes and containers built in stages, each one slightly different from the last. Prototypes. She understood that word. Each one a step. Each one leading somewhere. Her eyes moved upward, toward the ceiling. There, running along one side, was a pipe that disappeared through the wall. Margaret followed it with her gaze. It led toward the outside, toward the land, toward something beyond this room. Water. The thought came quietly, but it stayed. She walked toward the far end of the cellar. There, near the corner, stood a small table, different from the others, not for building, for writing. A chair sat tucked beneath it. On the surface, loose papers, a pen, and a small stack of folders. Margaret approached slowly. She didn't sit. Not yet. Instead, she reached for one of the folders and opened it. Inside were typed documents. Official. Structured. Her eyes moved across the page. Patent application. She blinked once, then read again. Her fingers tightened slightly on the paper. Another page. More details. Descriptions of a system. A compact filtration unit. Portable, efficient, designed to purify water using layered filtration and pressure flow. Margaret lowered the paper slowly. She turned back toward the room, toward the machines, toward the notebooks. Her mind began to connect the pieces, not all at once, but enough. He hadn't been fixing something. He had been building something, for decades. She picked up another document, more technical language, specifications. Test results. Her eyes moved over numbers she didn't fully understand, but the pattern was clear. Progress. Improvement. Proof. Margaret set the papers back down carefully. Her gaze drifted again across the cellar. The work, the structure, the intention behind every piece. Nothing here was random. Nothing here was unfinished. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a place someone went to pass time. This was work. Serious work. Work that had taken years. Work that had taken him. Margaret took a step back, then another. Her hand moved to the back of the chair, gripping it lightly. Her breathing had changed again. Not faster. Heavier. Fuller. She looked at the notebooks, the machines, the quiet order of everything. And then, slowly, she understood something she hadn't before. All those weekends, all those trips, all those times he had said, just fixing something. He hadn't been leaving her. He had been coming here, to this, to build something he never spoke about, something he never showed her. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape it, to take it in. When she opened them again, the room hadn't changed, but she had. Just slightly, enough to see it differently, enough to feel it. She moved toward the table again, her steps slower now. More careful. There was more here. She could feel it. Not just the work, something else, something he had left behind. And she knew who. This wasn't the end of what he had been building. It was only the beginning of what she was about to find. Margaret stood there a long time, her hand resting on the back of that chair, looking at the rows of notebooks, the quiet machines, the careful lines he had drawn over years. She thought she understood. All those weekends, all those empty chairs at dinner, all those times, she told herself, it didn't matter. She had thought she was being left behind, but he hadn't been leaving. He had been carrying something forward, piece by piece, until it was ready. Not for the world, for her. She moved slowly, touching the edge of one notebook, then another, like she was learning the shape of him again, not the man who said little. The man who stayed, in his own way. And for the first time, the silence he had lived in didn't feel like distance anymore. It felt like something he had been protecting, something he trusted her to find when the time was right. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Then she looked around that room again, not as a secret, not as a mystery, but as something meant to be seen. And she whispered, softer than she thought she could, "You didn't forget me." She stood there, surrounded by 30 years of quiet proof, and understood something she hadn't before. Sometimes love doesn't come back to you in words. Sometimes it waits. It builds. And it stays hidden until you're the only one left who can finally see it. And if someone in your life has ever been quiet, steady, always there but never noticed, have you ever wondered what they might have been holding for you all along?